Alrighty. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. This is OtterTalk number 27 with Dr. Zella. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Zella. Becky, thank you for getting this set up. I'm going to go ahead and toss it to you to go ahead and introduce Dr. Zella, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you. So I'm really excited to introduce to you Dr. Curtis Zella. He is one of the veterinarians that I work with at Veterinary Village in Lomira, Wisconsin. He is a partner with Dr. Marty Greer, who I think many of you know. Dr. Zella graduated from Purdue University in Indiana. He got his master's in physiology in 2000 and got his DVM in 2005 at UW-Madison. And then he started working in Lomira in 2005. Dr. Zella has had a couple of Bernese mountain dogs. So that's his primary breed. And during the time that he was at UW-Madison, he worked in the department that did necropsies. And so when I first met him, I had lost an Otterhound in 2014, and then I lost one in December of 2014 after I'd lost one earlier in the year. And both of those dogs had necropsies, and we were already clients of Veterinary Village in Lomira. And though there were people at the university that called and talked to me about the results of the necropsy, I didn't really have a good understanding of what it all meant because it's written in very precise, probably medical terms that were things that I didn't really understand. And he was so kind to go through the necropsy reports with me and help my husband and me understand what was going on. And then in August of this 2022, we lost our 7-year-old Spinoni. And it was Dr. Zella that had seen him and sent us immediately to the University of Wisconsin when we saw him at the practice in Lomira. Because he felt that there was an emergency going on. And as we worked through it from June through August, Dr. Zella was extremely supportive and kind and checked in with us all the time as we were going through the oncology treatments with PD. And so I just have to tell you what a kind and generous person Dr. Zella is. And so I'm going to let you meet him by letting him talk to you about this process that helps evaluate what might have happened to the dog during their lifetime that caused them to lose their life.
Okay, so if I'm ready, thank you, Becky. So Becky gave me some ideas for topics that you guys might be interested in. And if you have any questions, please, shout out, and I'll pause occasionally because I know this can be a little funky. But one of her questions is essentially, where can you find a place that does necropsies? I'm not sure where everybody's located, but an example might be here in Wisconsin. That's going to be with the vet school or with the state veterinary diagnostic lab. How many people here are within the vicinity of a vet school or diagnostic lab? I see one hand, two. Yep. So I think that's going to be your best case. If you do not have that as an option, there a lot can be learned of a basically post-mortem or a more simply gross necropsy, meaning looking at the anatomy of the patient after death at your local clinic if your veterinarian's appropriate doing that. So I wouldn't shy people away from doing that, but still our best case is going to be to reach out to a vet school or a diagnostic lab. I'm not sure there's going to be a lot of other options outside of clinics. I'm not sure human diagnostics are going to do anything with that. I haven't heard of any of that. So, does anybody have any questions about that? The next question Becky had thought might be interesting was, does your dog need to die at the place where a necropsy is done? Not necessarily. And oftentimes this probably isn't the case. Once again, you could potentially have a simple necropsy done if your veterinarian is comfortable with that at your clinic, but still you're going to be better off at a vet school. I believe our vet school usually wants the necropsy patient to be an active patient being treated there. Otherwise, it's going to be the diagnostic lab. And that's where a veterinarian is going to be involved and submit for the necropsy prior to anything happening. It's not like you can kind of show up at the diagnostic lab and say, here, I would like a necropsy. They're going to need a veterinarian attached to that. And it's my feeling that in a lot of ways, it's because you're going to need that helping hand in interpreting things. The pathology lab isn't going to necessarily be responsible for that. They're going to give you a very detailed, very generous report with references and complex explanations that, once again, you're going to have to go through with your veterinarian, and you're going to want that help. So does that dog need to die there? Not necessarily, but you're going to need a veterinarian's help to get a complete necropsy. Any questions about that? Okay.
I have a question about that, Dr. Zella.
Sure.
So if your dog dies elsewhere, then how would you have your vet transport the body to the place where the necropsy could be done, or what procedure would you take after death to have that performed?
What we would usually do is probably have the client take their animal and carry it. A veterinarian probably won't have anybody and might feel a little bit liable in that situation, but they will need to address the fact that the test has been ordered and attach their name to it. And then you kind of contact the diagnostic lab and say, hey, we're sending something down. You kind of request the test, kind of like taking a blood sample, except they're actually transporting the entire animal.
Is there a time frame that it has to be done within?
So that's a good question. It usually, anything past 48 hours is getting a little bit long. You can still learn information, but the tissue samples will not be as stable as they are getting into the 72-hour. If the animal can be chilled, not frozen, that can slow down the process of decay. But, once again, 2 days. So you're looking at a weekend, essentially. Your longest stretch is going to be getting it there on Friday and not having it looked at on Monday. So, but still, they may be able to maintain it under a better condition than you could at home.
So would you call ahead and say, hey, I have, my beloved dog here, and I can bring it to you, tomorrow morning? So did you call ahead and make that arrangement and then come in?
And if you're not comfortable with that, I believe most veterinarians would make that call for you, because you're in a situation where you just lost your animal. And, they may not have the availability for staff to drive it to an hour away or anything like that, but they can make that call, make that connection, and give you recommendations for how to submit essentially the sample, which is your pet.
Great. Thank you. That's great information. I appreciate that.
Another question that Becky had proposed was whether or not, and I thought a little bit about it, and have I heard of breed clubs learning about the prevalence of a particular disease through necropsy? And in a lot of ways, yes and no. This is complex in the sense that you almost have to be tracking it. So that was my initial thought, was your breed club needs to be tracking disease processes and then having them addressed potentially at the necropsy. Can it especially occur that, over time, say you've submitted for evaluating osteoarthritis, seizure sources, problems with the livers, things like that, and repeatedly they found adrenal tumors in your breed, as a secondary finding at a necropsy, someone's got to track that to know that that's happening. Otherwise, it's happening in Utah, it's happening in Michigan, it's happening in Minnesota. And unless somebody's pulling that together somehow, it would be hard to recognize that that disease process is emergent in a particular breed. Our example with our mountain dogs is Berner Guard, of course. And, you know, like my current breeder is quite vigilant about it in tracking everything that we could find out upon the death of the animal, and then logging it in with the pedigree in Berner Guard so that we can continue to track these things. So that's why we were very specific about my recent loss, where we did not have that necropsy. We had a family emergency and it wasn't available. So we had to piece together all the labs that we had at the end, all of my findings as a veterinarian, and piece together what we believed was the story that ended his life or led to his euthanasia. That is then entered into Berner Guard. And will that come up later? His in particular was some sort of neoplasia, which we couldn't document because we didn't have the necropsy. But he had elevated calcium in his system, which, how many Berners, if they die with elevated calcium, is that associated with cancer? That takes time and matching up and basically analyzing the system over and over again. And that's where your club comes in. That's where, you know, the Doberman Club or whoever else it might be comes in with tracking these things. So yes, I have heard of it because people have found things that they're tracking. Hence, you know, Bernese Mountain Dog histiocytosis, or systemic malignant histiocytosis, is a long, well-known term for Bernese Mountain Dogs, which probably drives their average age down to 6 years because they tend to turn up with it around that age. So that's an example of something that we could track. Other things may be emergent, but not if we're not doing necropsies. So I don't know if that answers that question, or if you guys have any other thoughts on that. Okay. And we can come back to anything if people have second thoughts down the road, of course. And then another question was, are necropsy sometimes done on a certain part of the body of the dog? Of course, this can happen where we have a specific look, but what we're doing is we're possibly throwing away, for lack of a better term, the rest of what we can learn. And there are many times that I can think of when I was working in the labs and that I've helped clients with interpretations that we have found things we did not know were there. You know, we could have thought that Becky's PD died purely of complications associated with lymphoma, but when we were sharing the report down the road, we found not one, but two other neoplastic or cancerous processes happening in PD that we had no idea that were there. One of which trickled down to causing multiple other organ degeneration, which probably also led to his demise. And something that now she knows and the club knows, that going forward, can we learn more by looking at additional necropsies and noting that in the records. So to say one part of the body is not, honestly, to me, a true necropsy. A true necropsy is going to be complete anatomically, at least, at a minimum. But what I really like about a complete necropsy, like they would do at the Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostic Lab, is it's going to be the histopathology too. We had to wait a little bit for it to come back on PD as an example. I think it was probably a couple of weeks, Becky. I don't remember. It was something like that. But we learned a lot more after that histopathology came back and could identify some of the gross lesions that they were talking about. Another way things might emerge is there are probably special interest groups at universities working on projects that we may not be aware of. So if your club is near, if you are a member of your club and your club is near certain areas where pathology is, you know, accessible, like the University of Wisconsin, could it not be something that somebody is studying? They're doing a research on the example that occurred off the top of my head is, what if people were doing cardiomyopathy research on Cavalier King Charles Spaniels, and they were the cardiac clinical instructor at the university. And here they are doing this research. And would they not be available were you to reach out and say, hey, my dog recently passed. It may not have been because of cardiomyopathy, but we could certainly submit it for a necropsy if you're interested in that, so that we can better the benefit of the breed to see to what extent that might be happening using histopathology rather than just echo or physical exam findings. So that would be another way that, not just club tracking, not totally on you guys, but what about contributing to the further research database at universities down the road? Especially in Petey's case, they've probably learned a lot about his lymphoma and how good the treatment was and how successful it was, considering that they had this full necropsy afterwards. If they had not had the necropsy, might they have thought, well, the treatment did so far, our survival time was X, but his survival time being X would have been not entirely determined by the lymphoma. It would have been determined by his age and other processings that were happening. So that's good research for them to translate into the human world or for future generations receiving treatment. Any thoughts on that? Questions? I don't have everybody in my view, so like if hands go up, you might have to shout out, but okay. What do we got here? Next page. Oh, the other question was how expensive it is to have a necropsy done. You're probably looking at an average of around $300, I would think. Now, this may not include additional testing. Sometimes they want to explore the histopathology in a different way, where they special testing, special stains to look at tissues, special preparations. Like I know a pathologist that had a heavy interest in eyes that would require a different preparation in order to look at the histopathology, to look at what he was looking for certain breeds, things like that. That may or may not be under your cost, depending on what the situation is. But if you Google it, you will probably see a $75 to $1,000 difference. What I would say is a $75 is either going to be an underserved area where they're not as concerned, or they just trying to generate more data, I suppose, or they're not doing histopathology. Because I would think the histopathology is going to cost you more, because you're going to need a resident pathologist. You're going to need a lab to prep things, to cut them in, things like that. And what I mean by cutting in is they will fix the tissue, slice it into multiple, so that they can look at the entire super thin slices and look at the cytoarchitecture, characterize certain things that may be going on in a brain tissue or adrenal gland or something that you just cannot tell by a gross examination.
So
I think
Dr. Zella,
yeah.
If you were going to be like, we have a couple of things in our breed, the seizures are one, and the other, we have quite a bit of cancer. And so if we were wanting to particularly look for seizure things, if they were to do a study of the brain, or what other parts of the dog's body would give you any indication about what was causing the seizure in the dog?
For seizures, if you're looking at epileptic sources, where it's basically in the brain, that would require histopathology of the brain, a thorough study of it. Probably not going to be necessarily a standard part of a necropsy, but that could be potentially requested. I think that's good research, especially even at the University of Wisconsin, which has a sizable neurophysiology program, which I was in prior to vet school. And that's what I did prior to vet school, was histopathology on brains for experimentation that we had done, looking at sensory perception and other kinds of things. So I know this is possible, but it's a bit involved. So to answer the second part of your question, I still think that where seizures are involved, even if we can't isolate particular foci, which would be a challenge to do, it's very challenging even in humans. You would look at liver, kidney, neuroendocrine parts of the body, adrenal gland. Is there some other reason that the system was stimulated in such a way and or metabolites were not eliminated the way that they should be that led to seizures? The animal with the liver shunt that isn't seen. If it's a small dog, you might not even see it on gross because it would be part of the liver histopathology. The cytoarchitecture of microvascular dysplasia, which is what we call, say, a Yorkie that has seizures. It's not a shunt outside of the liver that can be seen, but many micro shunts within the liver that would require sort of the histopathology or the cellular architecture in that liver sample. Those are the things you might see at a standard necropsy that would rule in or out a particular CNS or central nervous system epilepsy source. So that's where it's like one thing. So how many epileptics in your breed are actually epileptics? Or is there extra cranial versions of those that you're missing by not doing necropsies? That would be an example that I can think of.
Right.
But then once we get down to it, and the other thing I would say is save DNA, because if we can potentially track DNA long term, that may come back to being able to figure out a marker for those that are proven to be epileptic. Even if we can't cut in brains and have a pathologist do hours and hours going through every cellular spot in a brain, which I've done it. I've spent weeks doing it, looking at individual animal brains, looking for abnormalities and other kinds of things, tracking my basically experiments. That can lead to, a lot of time. I don't know if I see that happening, but if we rule out everything else and we have DNA samples and we continue to work toward markers, and they're learning markers all the time of different kinds of disease processes, and even from hearing loss, deafness in dogs. I know that's happening. I know the gentleman that's, trying to work on that as well. For breeding purposes, breeding away from deafness, can we get a marker for that? You guys know about markers for, canine neuropathies from the California Neuromuscular Lab and other kinds of things. So save DNA, do your necropsies, rule out everything that you possibly can. And then it'll come back to, is epilepsy isolated to certain sources? And then we know where they exist. Then we might be able to understand more about the foci. It's gone even so much that I worked with a neurology group at the university that was doing, working with another doctor who was trying to determine locus of epilepsy in humans by implanting electrodes and trying to measure all of these things all at the same time. Truly amazing work helping these people. But even that is such a challenge that it'd be hard for me to imagine that a pathologist is going to be able to just look at a brain and say, yeah, there it's epilepsy. It's going to be a while before we can do that, in my opinion. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, thank you.
When you have your vet order the necropsy, or you are doing it, if you personally, can you specify what systems you want checked or like that? Do you have a discussion with them saying, my dog had seizures and I want to know if this death is related to that? Or can you specify what testing you want done, or is it a all or nothing thing?
I think it's important to give them that information so that they have it. But in the end, they should be testing everything, regardless of what you specify. It's kind of like this. A more simple example was when I ask our specialist here, who we send our x-rays to, I can tell him that the poor puppy's been vomiting for 3 days. We're worried about the GI tract. But I will get back everything that he sees. He's going to see spondylosis in the spinal cord. He might see a little esophageal dilation. Is there other things that I wasn't even looking for, because that's how a necropsy should be done, just like he's doing those x-rays. And I think that's my experience at the UW. It's hard for me to say because I haven't had any other experience elsewhere, but they do put everything they have into it. And I think in some ways that's why the UW tends to reserve that kind of level for their patients, You know, if they were doing that for everybody that showed up at their door, I think that would get overwhelming for their staff.
Yeah.
So the diagnostic lab is going to be more suited for people that have not been to the university, essentially.
Yeah, cool. Joanne has a question. Joanne, if you want to go ahead and unmute your microphone and ask your question, feel free.
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering if, so I've always kind of lived in a remote area, but I had my vet do necropsies on a couple of my dogs when I didn't know the cause of death. But is it possible in that situation where many of us don't live near a veterinary center for a regular vet to preserve certain tissues or slides that could be sent on to a university center?
I think that's possible. If they're working with a center that they can send it to, I don't see how that's any different than us sending things to IDEX, for example, different samples. The problem is you won't have everything, of course. You're not going to get it all encompassed, but I don't see any reason why a national center can't do histopathology on a liver or a kidney. I don't see any reason that you wouldn't do that. It just, they're
Yeah.
going to have to spot it, right?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking of situations where, you know, we have specific disease in the dog and you know, you wanted, for example, the seizure dogs or something, that they may want to have a look at brain tissue, but may not have somebody available that can do that level of work. If it would be valuable to preserve those slides or the brain itself or whatever and forward it
Absolutely.
on to somebody.
I think if that's the case, I'm not even sure you have to, and I don't want to be overly graphic, but I'm not even sure you have to remove the brain in that setting. You might just have to isolate the head, potentially put it in formalin, at least get the fixation started. It would probably be better to have it removed, put into formalin, and then shipped. But you may want it to set up a little bit before you do that. You know, it's whatever the receiving lab is really looking for. And these things can be taught, you know, as far as if you have a specific situation and you have a veterinarian on board, then I don't see any reason why that can't be figured out. I mean, it's not that hard to teach sampling how people take things and then sending them to a lab. We do it all the time. Do you have a particular thing you were thinking of? I'm just curious.
No, I've been fortunate to have a vet who is very proactive in his own education and is very curious when it comes to specific things. I know amongst the many dogs I've had, we've had a couple more rare diagnoses, and he's always actually a couple of them. He asked if he could do the necropsy on the dog himself, and so if you knew in a case, I haven't had a seizure dog, but I was just thinking using that as because it's a general example in the club where there's many dogs all over the country who would never be able to access that. But if we could, or you knew ahead of time that you would like that done, if you could actually arrange to have it sent to a center, if your vet was as accommodating as mine. So
yeah, and I think that's totally doable. I don't see any reason why that wouldn't be an issue. But like I said, you have to have somebody on board. Somebody has to be ready to receive it.
Right.
And they're very likely there are, like I said before, there's university labs that are interested in this kind of research, studying for structure, studying other things. You get on board with that, and you could have a win-win situation where they're looking at structure. You're looking for possible areas where there might be sources for epilepsy, and that can be a fantastic combination. It's just going to be hard to kind of pinpoint who wants to do that kind of work.
That was my next, I guess that was my follow-up question, and I don't mean to dominate the conversation. I just thought that was my next question is, would the club be able to locate a somebody who is specifically doing research on epilepsy, maybe not specifically in Otterhounds, but have more of the diagnostics available to really help with that if that would make it available so we knew where you wanted it to go first, for example.
Right. It might be somebody at it might be at a more of a neurophysiology kind of forward university. I know that a lot of the research we were doing was in hearing and hearing loss at the University of Wisconsin. When I was with the neurophysiology group, that's the studies that we were doing. So would we loop that in with epilepsy? It was kind of the other way around when working with the human side, but there probably is. It just have to, that's one of those kind of knocking on doors kind of thing that you have to reach out to all those different places. And, it's gonna, a lot of people might say, hey, we're not doing that, but we just kind of have to ask.
Is there a database or anything that you could search those type of things of who's doing what kind of research, or what units or what universities are more specialized in that?
Not that I can think of specifically.
Yes, this
but
is
you guys
this
might
is
know.
Mark.
Yeah.
If you
Okay.
go to the CHF website and look under research, you can find places that are doing actual research. And this, Canine Health Foundation has a number of epilepsy studies out there. So that's a good way to find things. Looking at what grants they have, so you know what universities are looking, and you can then talk to them specifically if you think your dog has epilepsy, or if you know your dog has epilepsy.
Yeah, I was just thinking that might be something for the club to pursue. I know not everybody's, I know a lot of people are uncomfortable with the idea of necropsy, but if you could promote the health and well-being of the breed, that,
Yeah.
more people might participate if they knew it was as simple as, or it's never simple, but having that knowledge ahead of time makes it easier for people to prepare
Right.
for that, right?
I had a dog with, I'm lucky because I worked at Cornell and the diagnostic lab does the necropsies there. And I had a dog that was spending time in the clinics. At first, we thought he'd just gotten into a mycotoxin of some sort, because he was having tremors, and they went away, but they came back. And Dr. Center looked at him and said, I think he has a brain lesion. And when we decided to put him down because we could no longer control them, we did a necropsy. He had a full necropsy, but she was absolutely right. He had a brain infarct. He didn't have a tumor. He had a brain infarct right where she said it was going to be. And she wasn't a neurologist. She's a liver specialist type of thing. But so if you can work with your vet, the other thing in my breed, which is border terriers, is we're seeing more and more recognition of gallbladder mucocele. And I had a dog. A lot of these dogs get sick beforehand, and they're often misdiagnosed as pancreatitis based on their blood work. But now that we have more and more access to ultrasound, they can find a sludge or a blocked gallbladder. And I had a dog who was never sick a day of his life until he was 15 and a half, and he started vomiting, and his liver values were, crazy. And at his age, with his arthritis and deafness, I wasn't going to do surgery. So we just put him down and did a necropsy. And yes, he had a totally blocked gallbladder, but he'd never been sick before the 2 days before he got sick, So I think necropsies are very, very useful. I do them on my puppies. If I have a puppy that's born and that dies without us knowing, I will do necropsies on the puppy, partly because I know we have, in border terriers, we've seen congenital heart defects. And, people say, oh, it's just a fading puppy, and it's just but maybe because I have the luxury of having the diagnostic lab there, I can do it.
Yeah, I've never had the luxury of a complete necropsy, but I think there has been, I know my vet has been grateful for the opportunities to, when he has on some of mine, that, I know he says it's one of those things that, people just are uncomfortable with, but.
Yeah, I had my vet years ago do a necropsy on a dog, and he said it was pretty obvious that she probably had lymphoma because the entire intestinal tract was thickened, but she began to have seizures, and he said in this kind of thing, it could have had mets to the brain as well. So, but They can, so a good vet can often will do any, if you don't have access to a diagnostic lab, you can, your vet will often at least do a gross necropsy.
Right.
And maybe take tissues that they can send into the diagnostic lab.
Right.
Yeah.
Get myself muted.
I will too.
Thanks.
Okay, so yes, and that's an important point. Most good veterinarians, especially if you're working with them, can do a gross necropsy, and we're going to see a lot of changes that we would not see had we just not had it, because we're like, hey, I don't have a diagnostic lab nearby. And much like the seizures, which can be highly elusive, there are probably plenty of cancers that can be just as elusive too. Stuff in the, basically essentially like something buried in the bone marrow. Something buried in the bone marrow isn't going to necessarily be seen on a gross exam unless there's osteosarcoma or other kinds of changes there. Things can be hiding obviously in the brain tissue. Your example of the, infarct or the stroke type situation that would not be seen and presumed to be some other kinds of lesions. I was telling Becky earlier that I did a studied a particular case where hemangiosarcoma wasn't just isolated to the liver or the spleen, like oftentimes we assume. It was found in 8 different organ systems in that particular animal. It was in the brain, it was in the adrenal glands, it was elsewhere. So it's a lot of this is what we can't see is kind of determined by the necropsy, especially one that's complete and includes the histopathology. And probably the hardest topic to think about is just how do you decide if a necropsy is appropriate for your dog? And this is one that doctors and breeders and owners struggle with all the time, and it's obviously difficult and unclear, but the frank answer is yes, a necropsy is always appropriate, regardless of necessarily what you think. There might be rare instances that I can think of where it's obvious trauma. A dog is hit by a car or something unfortunate like that. You could still do a necropsy to understand the general systems, but I'm not sure going to get as much out of a 2-year-old trauma case as you would, for example, like your 16-year-old with the mucocele. Infections, can still lay in when they're young. You can learn a little bit about certain infections, like say blastomycosis, which is more common here in Wisconsin. You could presume that the blastomycosis is purely in the lung system, but blasto also affects eye, bone, and skin. And the more we know about that, the more we learn about infectious disease. So in a case where you'd say, hey, he died of blasto, I don't know if I want to do a necropsy. The necropsy can tell us more about the extent of that disease. And then, of course, if it's done at a university, that usually goes into their archives and contributes to the further general knowledge. The hard parts that I've come across when I'm, speaking with clients about this, it's different. It's different for people that breed and love a breed and move forward with trying to, give that breed the best future that they possibly can, to give owners longer times with their pets and healthier times with their pets. But sometimes when it's an owner, essentially you're faced with the question of, why would I do that now? It doesn't make a difference. And there also may be issues where I have some concern about some people just may not have the capacity at any one time to do a necropsy. They just can't imagine that. So I find that in a situation where I feel like that might be coming, you kind of have to prepare them ahead of time. If you're having conversations with your clients, speaking to obviously a breeder club, and oftentimes I often hope that breeders have a stronger relationship with their clients, as I have with my current breeder now. A great relationship that if I'm seeing things happening, if I'm seeing things going on, I'm like, oh, I'll call her up and I'll say, hey, you know, have you seen this before? What do you think is going on? We talk about it. That's the time that the breeder says, you know, okay, I haven't seen this, I have seen this, etc. Have these, you know, kind of, let's sit down and have dinner together conversations that turn into, hey, have you thought about necropsy? Have you thought about preparing for that ahead of time? Talk to your veterinarian about it. See what our options are so that when the time comes that we can just give that release and say, yes, this is a good idea. I'm okay with my dog going somewhere, being tested. And, you know, that's going to be okay when they're cradling their dog because in an acute or just too fast disease process. You can say, hey, would you like a necropsy? I find oftentimes that that just doesn't feel right, you know, so even veterinarians are like hesitant to say, I'm not going to ask for a necropsy. I mean, she's going through this or he's going through that. They lost their dog, their father died this year, and they just know this is not a good time for that. So preparing people ahead of time is good. Promoting your clubs in a certain way, like I'm aware of burner guard, you know, long before, you know, I even think about necropsy. But I know that they're keeping that information now because I'm on my third Bernese Mountain Dog. But my first one hadn't even thought about it. And had we talked about that initially saying, hey, you know, this is an awkward time, love your new puppy. But in the end, you know, everything gets better if we learn as much as we can. So maybe there is something to try to prepare people ahead of time. And of course, necropsy is going to be key for your breeding plans. You know, some new sources align. Somebody loses a pet at 2 years of age unexpectedly. That's definitely a situation where, you know, if you're working with your clients, if they're working with them, especially in guardian homes and things like that, they say, let's work together to encourage them to get a necropsy, because the answer is frankly always yes. We don't know unless we look. That's definitely part of it. The other question is what's it going to take? And we bridged this topic a little bit already. Are we in a location where it has to be a gross necropsy with an astute veterinarian that can at least give us that much information, and send samples that could be tested in a more rigorous fashion? Granted, you're not going to get everything, but if we got liver, pancreas, so that we know it's a mucocele, not pancreatitis, or some combination of the two as the example, that makes a big difference in which one came first, the chicken or the egg, what to look for, how to treat it ahead of time. You can give that information to your clients if you know that that's part of your breed, especially for new breed owners. And then cost, you know, what's going to happen with, you know, hey, I put everything I have into helping this animal at a university, you know, I just can't take another $300 or $400. That unfortunately we have to respect people's budget. And oftentimes I feel like if they've already gone that far, they're typically going to go ahead with a necropsy. But if it's at your clinic and, you know, their shoestring budget and lost their patient in unknown circumstances, that may sometimes be cost prohibitive, essentially. A lot of veterinarians will not charge for a necropsy, not ones that they do there themselves. If they've been treating an animal and we're just simply looking for answers. I'm not sure that I would, for any of my clients. I might just take a look and say, you know, it's limiting, but we're going to learn something and we're going to move forward. Obviously, with the full necropsy being a better option. Another thing that I don't know if it's even remotely possible, but sometimes there might be, you know, I kind of wish I had support from a fund that would say, hey, okay, you know, we're the breed organization, can we possibly contribute 20% of the cost of a necropsy, just to alleviate some of that, or whatever else, that we take donations and people keep a little pool somewhere that we could tap into should those circumstances arise. I don't know, that's for you guys to decide, but that's something that, you know, it's like, that's kind of, you know, philosophical, but what if we could put together something like that? I think that would be interesting. So in the end, always necropsy, but, you know, the truth is it depends on the situation. And I would have that conversation with your veterinarian at the time, and hopefully before the time comes, because the day of is not the time to talk about that, you know. But I'm sure you guys have other questions, or I can go through the process of what happens for a necropsy. A lot of you probably already understand that, but if you have questions, I can certainly go through that as well.
I have one question for you. What happens to the remains? Like after the necropsy, can you then go pick up your dog afterwards to be cremated, or what happens afterwards?
It's going to likely remain in the hands of whoever's doing the necropsy, and they will move to a cremation. The remains are still respectful, but it's beyond scope for someone to release that kind of situation for potentially for an owner to see. It's just too much for them to handle.
Yeah,
It's
and that
not
was what
something.
that was my I guess my bottom line of my question was, can you then like maybe get your dog's ashes back or remains, or
No,
you just say
right.
bye at the door? Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
So when I had my dog necropsied at the UW, they just sent the remains directly to the people that did the cremation, and I picked them up at the university. And I had a conversation with the people doing the cremation. It was very seamless and very smooth and very respectful in all the cases that I did. So.
Yeah, and I've found that to be the case at the university as well. The process is one of great respect and value to, at the university, for example, a teaching hospital, value to the students, to observe these processes, to learn from the pathologist the investigative process, in addition to the findings that they may have been on clinics. There were such situations where I would have been in clinics at the same time, a little overlap when I was working the necropsy, and I would find that even some diagnoses were just askew. An ultrasound didn't look exactly like what the gross tissue was. An adrenal tumor may not have been there. It may have been that the intestines looked a little bit thickened, but that wasn't the actual disease process. It might have been something entirely different. So sometimes you can find yourself surprised by what you find because of, that was almost 20 years ago. So the limitations on ultrasound have changed dramatically. We might have seen things that looked a little, subjective in interpretation from what actually was found in the true tissue. That can make a big difference too. And you can actually help, not, you think about your whole breed process, you could have a kennel go through a disease process that could require necropsy and additional blood and histopathological testing to determine the disease process that's destroying a kennel. I remember the entire team at the university working through a series of horse necropsies in a herd that was dying by the day. They had lost multiple horses, had gone down, big ones too. Like I believe they were Belgian horses, and it turns out it took them a couple days to figure out that it was something in the feed. There was a mismatch at the feed mill that somehow some sort of, can't remember all the details because it was so long ago, but some sort of cow coccidiostat or something that treated a parasite in cow ended up in the horses and was killing them. and that's, it's amazing that that kind of process that all can come together with everything that goes through the necropsy process. And it's pretty amazing, actually, and how many they saved by figuring that out, and then of course pulling that feed, and that's primarily what they needed to do. Lots of fascinating exotics. We did necropsies on, I did a necropsy on hippopotamus at the University of over at the zoo in Milwaukee, and it was odd enough that we had walked away thinking that the animal may have just choked on a food product, an apple or something like that. I think that was the general statement, was he choked on an apple. 4,500-pound animal. I doubt that that's what it was. There was a lot of work that needed to be done when I had walked away from it. That was gross, but just, it can be a fascinating process, and we can learn so much. It's just so much not to be wasted. Any other questions? Necropsy or not? It's a hard topic. It's a sobering one, but it's just it's our strongest test, and it's the truth. It's like reading a book at the end. And I could, if you don't mind, Becky, I could read the findings on PD just to give you guys an idea of what you might get from a full necropsy. I'd kind of highlighted some things because I was looking at it earlier. But with the histopathology that we came up with at the end was just amazing. They had written down multiple different points, but PD ended up with a neuroendocrine adenoma of the parathyroid gland, a thymic mass. He had mineralization in his kidneys, glomerular sclerosis and tubular degeneration in the kidneys, likely secondary to the mineralization. His prostate gland, he had prostatitis, prostatic urethritis, and probably cystitis, likely related to, I think at the time, Becky, we were thinking that might be the chemotherapy that had been leading to some bladder infections that probably led to a lot of that. He had a little bit of congestion and fibrosis in his liver, nothing more than an age-related change. Pulmonary edema, probably secondary to some of the lymphoma that had created different disruptions of blood supply. Or there at the end, there was some mineralization in the lungs, would have decreased his capacity, and that may have also been related to the parathyroid gland. There was lymphoplasmacytic and eosinophilic enteritis, a little bit of a sort of immune-mediated enteritis or inflammatory bowel disease, some histiocytosis in his lymph nodes, spleen, lymphoid depletion, aortic root, part of his heart, metaplasia, a little bit of a different change there. Most of these are going to be all age-related changes, but here they are. They've gone through, and I've got a 6-page report of everything they can possibly think of, in addition to multiple references for the disease processes for your veterinarian to go understand more back into the literature. The wealth of knowledge in this report alone is outstanding, and if Becky weren't willing to do that, then they don't have that. You don't have it. I don't have it for my future in understanding what was happening with him. So that can just be huge. In the end, it was.
Oh, I was just going to say, Dr. Chun, who is the head of the oncology department there, was totally shocked by the report and all the things that were going on with him, because the most surprising thing also was the fact that his lymphoma was under control, that the chemotherapy had worked, but there were all these other things.
And the exact statement was, evidence for lymphoma is not seen in the examined tissues. Thus, recurrence of this dog's lymphoma with subsequent hypercalcemia malignancy is considered unlikely. And that's a huge diagnosis, because we would have presumed without a doubt that the hypercalcemia was the lymphoma, because that's commonly understood as far as what diseases do we have hypercalcemia. In my own recent loss of my mountain dog, that was the only thing that characterized whatever process was happening with him was a mild hypercalcemia. Could it be that he had lymphoma? Maybe, but in this case, it wasn't. It was actually a parathyroid gland tumor that was doing PD's hypercalcemia. So even if we treated the lymphoma, and we did successfully, as Becky's noted, and Dr. Chun was amazed by that, the parathyroid gland would probably have had to have been addressed at some point as well, if it were possible. But I think PD's decompensation precluded anything of that nature. I just think it's fascinating in a way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of it is academic, shocked, and a lot of it is academic. But if we don't do that, if you guys aren't doing this, if we're not doing this with our Bernese Mountain Dogs, we'll never get to the bottom of histiocytosis. You know, we're going to have to keep doing these things to really understand that process. And we need a marker, essentially, kind of like I was talking about. I think all of our breed clubs should be preserving as much DNA as possible, even if it's retroactive. You know, and you guys that are breeding, you're probably doing it already. When you're doing your semen collections and your breedings for your females and such, and your genetic testing as much as you can. And I thought it like, for example, I thought it was fascinating that the gentleman that's doing all that I learned to do bear testing for, which is the hearing testing I do for our breeds now. He's got a lab working on collecting as much DNA from the people that he's testing and trying to match up other parameters like blue eye, you know, one blue eye common, how much white is on the face of this side or that side of like an Australian Shepherd, things like that. So he's generating all these markers and trying to find patterns in the DNA. And I think that's just amazing. And if we can do that in the long run with how many otters have had seizures, and we track that in a database, you just need to find somebody who's willing to really ramp up your database. I'm not sure what the situation looks like now. I know Becky and I briefly talked a little bit about it. I also find that kind of fascinating. I actually helped the Necropsy group in Madison work with their database to kind of bring it up to speed, make data entry a little bit easier and things like that. But my coding days are long behind me. That was many years ago. So there's a lot of better people out there doing that now.
Well, everybody, are we all set?
I'm sold. I'll necropsy everything from now on.
Yeah.
It's really good information. That's one reason why we wanted to have you do this presentation for us, Dr. Zella, is to bring people's awareness, you know, to that, and maybe dispel, you know, any rumors or anything like that, make it
Right.
easier to think about. And we're working on, you know, getting our Otterhound database improved. And, you know, maybe it's something that the breed club wants to do something in the future, as far as, you know, maybe if the person is willing to do a necropsy and have that information put in the database, maybe the club, you know, can do something as far as, you know, making you know, offsetting a portion of the cost of the necropsy or something like that. It'd be something that the club could definitely discuss and see if that's something that we could do.
I think that would be wonderful. You know, it's about data collection but somebody has to manage it. Somebody has to analyze it. Reaching out, like Joanne had said, reaching out to, you know, people looking for epilepsy research, things like that. That makes a huge difference. And people want that data. These professors, they need that information. Not a lot of people are willing to submit for necropsy for them to get that data. We don't want to just randomly experiment on animals. We want to use an existing population. We don't want to grow these animals up and just experiment on them. Those days are probably not, hopefully, far behind us, that we can get more information from in my opinion, from living stock, so to speak.
Exactly.
People that,
Joanne has a question. If anybody else has any questions, feel free to, when Joanne is done, unmute and go ahead and ask. So Joanne, go ahead.
Yeah, it wasn't so much a question as a commentary, but first of all, I really appreciate that, we could have this conversation tonight and for everybody participating. But, in my experience, even I think opening up those conversations more, as was previously mentioned, with whether you're a breeder or an owner or you've had a necropsy done, and normalizing the conversation and making people feel. I just had a conversation about this with another Otterhound owner who had said, "Oh, I'd never had that done. I don't think I could ever do that." And we had a good general conversation about it, and it was surprising how much their thoughts had changed by the end of it. And it came up casually, not as neither of us had anybody dying at the moment or anything. And I think maybe the club could do something more as with educational materials or promotion, of this is how it's done, this is what happens, this is where you can get it done if your Otterhound is maybe sick or has these particular diseases, that it's something worth thinking about, whether it's creating a pamphlet or putting it in the newsletter now and then. I think it's an important topic, as our veterinarians learned so much from it, and the breed club would learn so much from it, taking the stigma away from, oh my God, I'm going to cut up my dog and I'm destroying what's left of him, when most of us are going to cremate anyways. I think if we can normalize these conversations, there's a lot of benefit to that. So I think that's about all I had to add.
Yeah, we agree. And that's why we had this. I know Becky has been, or at least Becky and I have been talking about this for, gosh, Becky, 8 months, 9 months. Do we put it in the newsletter? Do we have an OtterTalk? Do we, what do we do to raise awareness? So I think we're on the same side of that as you are, Joanne.
Yeah, it's just yeah, and I'm glad you did. And I think it's one of those things that, whether it just needs to be promoted and normalized more in general conversation, that promoting the value of these things, especially in such a rare, lovable breed of dogs.
We agree.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's good talk.
Becky, do you have any closing comments? Becky?
You have done.
Dr. Zella, do you have any closing comments?
Oh, no, nothing that I can think of. I think it's about, I still want to reiterate that it's about communicating with your clients, preparing them for that, in those ones that you have that kind of relationship with, of course. And they should talk to their veterinarians. They should talk to the universities, get a feeling for the process. I know how ours works, but everybody else's situation is going to be a little bit different. So it's establishing relationships, in my opinion, and being prepared ahead of time. I think that's best. And it's not you guys, it's the clients. It's the ones that aren't, it's your clients that I think need the most help with this, to understand the importance of it. And other meetings where you guys have with groups, celebrate the knowledge, celebrate the understanding as much as we can, share your experiences like Becky is now with her experience with PD. And I think that'll make a big difference.
Yeah, I agree. That's very good advice. It is something that the more you talk about it ahead of time, the more effective it is at the time when you need to have that conversation when somebody's heart is broken.
Right.
Yes, exactly. Well, I would really like to thank Dr. Zella for taking the time to talk with us. And I think that your talk has been very worthwhile. And as Robin has said many times, how it's great because people can access this talk. If they weren't able to come tonight, they can go to our library and watch this. And we really appreciate you doing it for us.
Oh, thank you.
Exactly.
I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah.
Really do appreciate it. And like Becky said, this will be in our YouTube library on the Otterhound Club of America channel. We'll have links to it, other places too. It goes on Groups.io. It's there's going to be a list in the Otterhound University website page as well. So there's plenty of places for people to find it. I will also be emailing the link to everybody that attended or registered and was not able to attend. A little ad for our next OtterTalk is going to be on February 8th. We're going to have Laura Reeves from Pure Dog Talk. And then for members, we're also having a roundtable meeting on next Wednesday at 8 o'clock to discuss the database. And this is something that we can definitely even bring up during that roundtable talk too, that this is one of those things that if we have more owners able to do this and share the information, that can be definitely a benefit to the breed as a whole, the club as a whole, owners, and make that database even more useful. So I appreciate everybody being here. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.